the Task Management and Time Blocking Podcast.
Episode 36.
You're someone who does a great deal of time blocking in your calendar. You follow the best practices and don't try to schedule big, complex tasks. Instead, you schedule their subtasks. But how do you deal with tasks whose complexity is hidden? In other words, the task that you are engaged in contains far more subtasks than you imagine. And it's a bit like watching a 4 hour task turn into a 20-hour task. When you're on the receiving end, it's not pretty. It can be very upsetting. But is there anything you can do? Tune into this episode to hear from me and my special guest, Trevor Lohrbeer, as we tackle this wicked productivity problem together. I'm Francis Wade, and welcome to the Task Management and Time Blocking Podcast. And we're back. And as you can see, I'm joined on the stage by my special guest, Trevor Lohrbeer. This is Trevor's third time with us here on the podcast. And there's a reason that he's been invited back this many times, more than anybody else. And in a minute, I'll introduce him. But if you're new to the show, you may be wondering what exactly is going on here. This doesn't look like the traditional podcast. And guess what? It's not. So this is not an interview. As bright and as compelling as Trevor is, he's not here to be interviewed. He's here as a guest to tackle the wicked problem that I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast. And what you'll be listening to is our attempts to diagnose the problem. We're trying to share with you some of the underlying thinking, trying to pop the hood or put up the bonnet so that you can actually see the inner workings of the kind of things that we do when we're trying to solve these problems. And we may present the final answer to you at some point if we arrive at one, but it could be more interesting to hear exactly how we got to it. So here in this particular case, we don't have a final answer to this particular problem, but we're going to share with you our best thinking, our best intuitions, and our best insights. And hopefully by doing so, you'll be able to take them, apply them to your own life and use them in your own situation. We're following what Einstein said. He said if he had an hour, he'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about the solutions. So we're going to be diagnosing, and we'll also have an insight bell, which I'll ring when one of us comes up with an insight that the other person has never heard before. Why? Well, because coming together is more than just sharing ideas. We want a little bit of synergy to happen, some serendipity, so that we put our best ideas together and come up with something brand new that maybe moves the needle for the first time ever. So to help us on our way, let me tell you a quick story, then I'll introduce Trevor. Evelyn, she's due for a promotion to become a manager. And her leadership team is watching to see if she has what it takes to function at kind of the next level. She's nervous, as this is not a guarantee, and she needs to support her son's acceptance at a very expensive college or university. So she has some bills that are coming due and she needs the extra income. Recently, however, she missed a major deadline by almost 2 weeks, and now she realizes that she must up her games, so to speak, improve her performance. And a little bit more background, for the last year, she has been assigned to these unique projects, kind of first time, one of a kind sort of efforts. They're the most difficult to plan and predict because of the number of complex tasks involved. And that's why she missed the last deadline and has been missing more than a few here and there. A seemingly simple task exploded and became far more difficult all of a sudden. So she's got to find a way to cope, but she's really not sure how to proceed. And that's why I invited Trevor. So Trevor Lohrbeer is the founder of Day Optimize, a digital day planning web app, and he's also a productivity expert. Since the release of ChatGPT, he's turned his passion toward AI, learning how to use, configure, and build AI chat applications to increase productivity and develop new ways of interacting with AI. In November 2023, a few months ago, he started the AI Meets Productivity podcast with a GPT he customized to be a podcast host. Trevor, welcome to the show. And what do you think about Evelyn?
Thank you so much. It's good to be here. I think Evelyn has challenges that we all face from time to time. We all run into these hidden tasks that derail us and make our deadlines seem like phantom deadlines, not real. They just kind of have to keep being pushed back because we keep running into things that we didn't anticipate.
Right. And when we're on the receiving end of these, I don't know about you, but my experience is one of heightened frustration. And I start desperately looking for shortcuts, and it doesn't work to find these shortcuts because when the task is truly complex, it means that whatever plans I had for the rest of the day or week, depending on how bad it is, they go out the window. So, we all want to be, if you're listening to this podcast, folks, chances are you want to be super productive. And then there are these moments where you run into these kind of hidden bombs. And so not only does a task take longer, but there are other problems too, right, Trevor?
Well, yeah. I think one of the things with them that affects your productivity is this: when they're unexpected hidden tasks,
Mhm.
we often find ourselves getting way more stressed out about them, and they kind
Mhm.
of derail our productivity because suddenly you,
Mhm.
you were like, we're going along. We thought like I had an hour for this task, and a bunch of other hidden tasks popped up, and not only like is that task itself now delayed and taking longer, but you kind of feel off your game for the rest of the day or the rest of the week of like, wait a second, like it's disorienting when you don't know those hidden tasks are there. So I think one problem is like there's going to be tasks that we don't know what steps are going to need to happen to actually finish the task. Those are the classic hidden tasks. But the second degree part of that problem is that we're not even expecting hidden tasks to be there, and that
Mhm.
surprise can affect our productivity because it can derail us and disorient us.
Right. Right. It means that the rest of our week and whatever buffers we had built into our nice, nifty, optimized schedule go to heck. And now we're having to, like Evelyn, we're having to explain to our uppity ups, people who we're accountable to, that we're not going to be reaching our targets. So we're, some uncomfortable conversations now ensue. Um, and, the kind of things that can keep you up at night. And it's all because you came upon this hidden task that you just didn't know. And we'll talk about this, but when you're in the middle of it, you can feel very anxious and stressed, as Trevor said. And but in terms of sort of the bigger picture, this is not a problem that will ever go away. This is a problem to be managed. It's always been there. It has always been in anyone's thinking, though it should be pretty easy to do this part of the task of the job of the project. And you mentally allocate certain amount of time to it, and then you get a rude surprise. But this is not new. When they were building the pyramids, right? I don't know what problems for the pyramids, but I'm sure they had some of them, right? The sand is not the proper sand, or the foundation is going to take 10 times to build, or whatever it is. There's always something. So question is, given the epic nature of this problem and the fact that it's always around and it's never going to go away, what can be done about it? Are there intelligent ways to approach it so that you can mitigate its effect, you can anticipate when it's going to happen, you can respond more effectively in the moment? Um, any other outcomes you can think of, Trevor?
No, I think those are good. I think to me the two things, the problem breaks down into uncovering them as much as we can, and then anticipating where they might be when we can't uncover them.
Right, right. And there's there's probably things that, I know if I'm an Evelyn, I don't want people to think I'm going to be incompetent. So I'm not necessarily going to, you know, I don't want to telegraph that I don't know what I'm doing, and I don't want to jeopardize my promotion. I want to be effective, and I want to appear to be effective. So there's also some ego involved. For me, Trevor, you might be a
Yeah.
different kind of a more evolved individual, but for me, I want to look good and have them like me because I hit my deliverables.
Well, I
Saying it
think
like
it's
this.
it's not just. I think you can have the ego aspect of there, but it's also the effectiveness of you. Is like if people view you as incompetent, they are not going to interact with you in a way that helps you be competent. And so there's almost you need people to view you as being competent to work with them effectively to be competent. So even if you're totally competent, but everyone views you as incompetent, then they're maybe not going to respond to you as quickly. They're not going to treat your what you say is worth the same as what someone else says, and then that itself is going to make you incompetent. So yes, it can be an ego thing, but I think it can also be an effectiveness thing. It's you do need to be perceived as being competent to be competent.
Right. So I agree, and I imagine that Evelyn is kind of maybe, she wants the promotion, so there's a perception involved, no matter what she does, and she realizes that this promotion could be at risk, right? Because she's not delivered, and as she goes along, as she looks to the future and the kind of work that she's doing, she may be thinking, why do I think I'm going to be safe? And probably when she was doing previous kinds of more repetitive work, she probably had a sense of confidence because she was doing the task decomposition. She was breaking down tasks into subtasks, and she was highly effective, because she was in a more predictable universe. Now things have changed, and she's on these different kinds of projects, and her confidence turns out to have been misplaced, or maybe it was hubris, or she thought she had handled the problem. But it's a good training ground because if she gets to be a manager, hello, she's going to have people who are working for her, who are going to give her all kinds of false confidence that they know what they're doing, when in fact they don't, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the one thing we talked about, like the skill that she'd learned in the projects that were very predictable, that idea that I'm going to take my project, break it down into tasks and subtasks, and be very detailed, are classic project management skills that we learn. It's like, hey, if you got a task, break into subtasks so you know what needs to get done. That can also be a source of the problem in that by doing so, you gain this false sense of confidence that you then have completely described the problem because I've broken it down and I've thought about it
Right.
ahead of time. So therefore, I should have captured everything. And maybe I even went and allocated time and estimated time for every subtask. And so, like, I'm very confident with my time estimation for the whole project. But if we don't think about the hidden tasks in there, that's what can derail us. And then that's what, again, causes more stress because we had this false sense of confidence. So having a little bit of humility there, going, yes, it's important to break down everything into subtasks and kind of identify everything, but also recognizing you are probably missing something. And so how
Right.
do we find out what you're missing and anticipate, either uncover what you're missing or anticipate that, yeah, this is an area where I just know I'm going to be missing something. So be prepared for those things to pop up that you didn't think about.
Right. And I think that those of us who've been time blocking for a while can feel that sense of overconfidence because it works so well
Yeah.
when tasks are understood. Right. It does
And
work, and it's
again,
far better than the other guy who doesn't time block.
and it goes back to every technique, every piece of advice is context sensitive. So like if something is predictable, then time blocking works really well. Breaking down your task works really well.
Mm-hmm.
Once you go into these areas of unpredictability, then that strategy and those techniques break down. It's not that they're completely useless. You still might want to use them, but they're not going to completely solve it. So like if I know you write an article, I forget if it's every week or every month, but like writing an article, you probably have it down. You know what your subtasks are. There's very few hidden tasks in that because you just repeat it over and over again. You can time block it accurately. That's very predictable. Whereas if you were saying, okay, I want to go and create a new AI chatbot with all the content I created, well, you've probably never done that before. And so there's going to be a huge number of unknown tasks in there, these hidden tasks that are going to completely derail you.
I didn't even know I could do that. So you're going to tell me after our call how I can do that? You could do that. This
Yes,
one
you
is
can do
news
that.
to me. Okay, so we're gonna have a conversation because I'd like, I'd like a nice shortcut when it comes to these things, and I want to reduce the chance that I'm gonna run into one of these unexpected, unwanted kind of complex tasks that will just end up derailing me. Before we came on the call, we talked about the difference between an execution and exploration plan. It's here in my notes, and maybe understanding the difference between the two could give a different kind of confidence. I know this is kind of solutions, but do you recall the distinction?
I'm trying to remember now. Let's see. What were the two
See,
things
I thought it was
again?
your brilliant insight, so that's why I gave it to you. I was like, Trevor knows what we're talking about here.
um, oh, actually, I see. Exploration. I misheard. Execution versus an exploration plan. Yes. So the idea here is that distinction between I've got a list of tasks or subtasks that I'm just going to execute, go straight through those, versus the idea that, hey, I want to explore because there's going to be hidden tasks within here. So how can I take those things and explore to kind of surface as many hidden tasks as I can before executing? And so a lot of times we just think about what is our execution plan? How do we break those things down? The exploration plan is going down and looking at each of those tasks and trying to identify, okay, which of these tasks might have hidden tasks within them? And then exploring that up front to uncover them more.
Right. Let's expand on that when we get into solution mode, because this points to, I think it's the first insight of our time together, or insight bell. I'll bring that. But this is a key differentiator, because time blocking is typically thought of as a bit mechanical. Tell me if I'm wrong, as which is where the false confidence comes in. Because when you're mechanically time blocking simple stuff, you do get on a roll. You're able to just kind of crank out the widgets. But then life intervenes and along comes a complex task, and your old way of cranking out the widgets doesn't work. I think it's one of the criticisms that people have of time blocking, and why they say some people say you shouldn't do it, because you can't be sure that you're going to be able to follow your schedule. So don't even bother to try. No, that's a little bit of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? It's like say, oh, you might die one day, so don't even live. By that argument, but let's hold that and come back to it. Hold that point and come back to it just a little bit. So this business of the overconfidence is kind of what we're imagining that Evelyn is experiencing. She's experienced in the past, and why she's so thrown at the moment. But if she accepts the fact that this is what life looks like now, and what it's going to look like in the future, there's going to be more of it, not less. I think she would have a very different mindset, and maybe that mindset shows itself in the exploration versus execution kind of distinction. So we'll come back to that too. Unfortunately, if she, or actually, listener, let me talk to you. You may be listening, trying to gain some facility or gain some skills in dealing with all kinds of tasks and all kinds of challenges, especially those that are kind of semi-creative. And you want to get to the point where you're not blindsided and thrown off course, especially if you are more of a mechanical time blocker, that these things can not only throw you off course, but they make you feel like you're not productive anymore. Some people would say, well, I'm going to stop time blocking because clearly it doesn't work. They may even go to that extreme. But you may want to leave here with more of a, I won't say a buffer, but with more capacity to be flexible. Um, because what we're hinting at is that this is a part of your life as long as you get past a particular level in a company, and particularly if you get to the management level, this is going to become a problem, more of a problem. Would you say that's accurate, Trevor, or do you see it differently?
No, I do see it differently. I think at the managerial level, things can, to some degree, become a little bit more predictable because a lot of times, like your life just becomes meetings, meeting.
True. Yeah.
So
Right.
the overall, the nature of the problem changes because at that point in time, your unknowns are managing other people who are encountering these unknowns versus yourself. So it really kind of depends upon like what the work that you're managing is doing. So
Mhm.
yeah, again, if you are developing a new product, you're trying to like invent a new drug, a new technique, a new
Mhm.
whatever.
Mhm.
Invention is going to have a lot more unknowns than, say, you know, if I'm running an editing company and all we do is we
Mhm.
get in manuscripts and we edit them. There's going to be a
Mhm.
lot less unknowns as a manager in that case. So it's really what the work
Mhm.
is doing rather than if you're
Okay.
a manager or an actual employee doing that work.
Okay. Interesting. I'll share with you my reasoning. Is that you have people working for you as a manager, and they're the source of variability, but they could be reliable workers. My general assumption is that when you get people working for you for the first time, you're blown away by their competence. And you try to compensate by doing their work for them, but the first thing that hits you is that they don't
Well,
know what they're doing. Anyway, that's just
and this is
personally.
an
What do you think?
interesting point, is like being able to make this distinction between predictable and unpredictable work in evaluating your employees, right? Did I give
Mhm.
my employee a predictable task that was at their level, their skill level, so they should have been able to do it in a predictable time?
Mhm.
Or did I give them an unpredictable task and
Mhm.
I thought it was predictable, and now I'm unfairly judging them because they weren't able to meet that deadline? But there were a lot of hidden unknowns within that task that they had no ability to evaluate. Maybe I could have actually evaluated because I have more experience in this. I could have told them where the hidden unknowns were. But that
Mhm.
idea of, yeah, figuring out how to evaluate the incompetent employee from the employee who is just struggling with a new task they've never done before that has a lot of hidden unknowns.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
if I hire a social media manager who's supposed to be managing my social media, I'm going to expect them to be able to post on Twitter, post on Facebook, do all that kind of thing. There should be very few unknowns in there. So if they're not meeting the deadline, I can say, okay, that's probably due to their skill level, their competence level, etc. But again, if
Mhm.
I hire, um, you know, I'm a big pharma and I'm hiring someone to do drug development, and I say, okay, you
Mhm.
need to like create this breakthrough drug in 3 months, and they don't create it in 3 months. Is it my fault for setting the 3 month deadline, or is it their fault because they weren't able to like invent something new in 3 months? Um,
Mhm.
Again, different scenarios. How
Mhm.
likely is the work to have these hidden tasks, and that then helps us evaluate our employees and helps us learn how to manage that as well. Because you know, part of our job as a manager is going to be to surface those hidden tasks that the employees may not see. So there always going to be, for some projects, there's always going to be hidden tasks that no one knows. But there's some hidden tasks that I know that my employee doesn't. So how can I communicate that to them and say, here's the hidden tasks you're going to need to account for and deal with in this process?
Yeah, yeah. So let's move into solution mode because I'm thinking I actually had this situation. So I have a kind of an intern. uh, who works for me, and she took over a task that someone else used to do for me. So I had one intern
Mm.
replace another intern, and the prior intern. So he went through. He had a. They were all unknowns to him at that point, and some of them were unknown to me because it's one thing to be able to do something yourself and then give it to somebody else to do if you've been doing it for a while, because you've forgotten all of the complexities that are involved, that because you've
Mhm.
already figured it out, right? So when I handed it over to him, he was, for some things, he was like, "What?" And I'd repeat the instruction and he'd be, "What?" It's not that he's dumb, smart guy, but it's that I have things that I understand about the job that he doesn't. And if I haven't prepared him properly, if I hadn't and I didn't put myself in his shoes and say, what's it like for him receiving this particular instruction or receiving this task or project? And I wouldn't see the complexity. And I wouldn't anticipate that he says, it took me a whole 5 hours to enter two names. And I'm like, what? It's supposed to take 10 seconds. And then he explains, and I'm like, oh, I totally forgot. Now that I have his replacement, I'm way more careful to
Mm.
explain things to her in a way that I didn't explain them to him. So she's facing far less complexity than he did. But that's only because I went through, I made all the mistakes the first time around. And second time I've kind of figured it out. But it makes me think that there's something, I don't know if it's extraordinary, but there's some way in which or when we're delegating, we need to put ourselves in the shoes of the other person so that the complexity is reduced. And I can't tell you that that's easy, because having just made a mess of it, I think it's actually really hard. But it makes all the difference in the world to the person who's going to do the task. What do you think?
Mhm. No, I totally agree with that. Like, I mean, understanding the context within what someone's operating in, their life experience, their skills, their knowledge in general, and about the work you're doing is critical to give them the right information to be able to do it. I think one of the struggles sometimes, the mistakes people make, for instance, when outsourcing overseas, or
Right.
it can even be to any different culture, is that the cultural
Virtual
assumptions are different.
virtual worker, for
And
example.
yeah, and we have certain assumptions that we don't communicate because there are cultural hidden assumptions in our culture. And then when we interact with someone from a different culture, if we don't surface those assumptions, they're going to bring in their own assumptions, and then so how they interpret what you say is different. But the same can apply to like people working in different types of companies have different type of cultures. And so like if I came from culture X and I'm going to culture Y, I might need to make that translation, that adaptation as well. So yeah, hidden assumptions are similar to hidden tasks. Like, what are the things that like we're not sometimes we're not even aware of, so we don't know how to communicate them. But certainly, when we are aware of them, or when we can at least introspect to become aware of them, how do then we communicate them?
Right. And I also noticed with the fellow I had working for me, he became faster at certain tasks than I could be. So he
Mhm.
by virtue of repetition, and also he was younger and he's a bit more snappy with his thinking than I was. He figured out ways to do things faster than I could. Uh, he so if I asked him to do something and do something with 100 names, 15 minutes later he's done.
Yeah,
I couldn't do it that fast. But so there's also accounting for um, a learning curve when it comes to
yeah,
delegation, no? And even with ourselves, I think there's a learning curve. It's just that we're more likely to think that we're higher up on the learning curve than we are when it comes to dealing with complex tasks. I don't know if that's a built-in thing. What do you think?
um, I don't know if we think of ourselves as higher up, but again, I think it's very easy to um, forget about those hidden tasks, which are the things that derail us a lot of times in that. So it's when you have a complex task, we make the mistake that it's a simple scale thing, that like a complex task is just a bunch of simple tasks put together.
Mhm.
And that's not true. So it's
Say some
just
more about that.
so going back to the task breakdown that most people do. It's like, okay, I've got this complex task. Let me break that down into a bunch of subtasks. Let me simplify that into simpler and simpler subtasks, and then therefore I'll be able to do the entire task more. Well, with a complex task, even if you could identify all the subtasks, and right now in this episode we're talking a little bit about hidden tasks, we'll get to that in a second, you have dependencies between those tasks that you don't with the simple tasks. So just that, adding dependencies between simple tasks, increases the complexity. But then we have these hidden tasks, which also have dependencies with those tasks that we've identified. So not only with a complex task do we have a collection of simple tasks that are dependent on one another and affecting each other, we also have these tasks that we don't even know about, hidden, embedded within that complex task. So those are two issues why a complex task is not simply a scaled up simple task.
Programming is involves a lot of complex tasks, which with unique, unforeseen dependencies. People who design apps tell me all the time that, not all the time, whenever I meet them, that you think an app is so easy, because I'm the kind of guy who says, "Why don't you just develop an app for that?" And they look at me like, "You idiot! You think it's that easy? Developing an app is way more. You think it's easy, and the concept seems straightforward, and they actually try and go to do it, and you won't believe the complexity." This is what they tell me, because the interrelationships that they need to master or they need to translate into code are just at a whole nother level of complexity than you think of when you think of, "Oh, why don't we just put an app together for that?" And the two are in two different worlds. But you're a software guy. You tell me.
Well, let's dive into that, because I think that this is going to be a useful metaphor for a lot of different, particularly client-based projects, but it could also be for your boss too. Is say you want to, like, I get hired to do app development, right? One of the things, or anyone gets hired to do app development or any project, one of the things you often want to do with your client is to show progress early on, because like they hired you. And so what you tend to do is you tend to do the surface tasks, the easier tasks first. So maybe like what I do is let me model out the whole interface, and save the complexity in the back end that no one's going to see till later, because you want to be able to show progress to your boss, your client. The problem with that approach is now what we've done is we've taken the tasks that are more likely to have hidden unknowns and pushed them toward the end of the project and done all the easy tasks up front.
Boy, oh boy,
And
oh boy.
now we've basically created our own time bomb. We're like, we get this, the client now thinks we made so much more progress and we're working so fast. So they're all excited about the deadline we created. Or your boss is super excited. And then when you can't meet the deadline, it's like, well, you got everything. Give me that beautiful interface or that beautiful first draft or whatever in the first month, and it's 3 months later. How can you not have it done? Instead, what we need to do is we need to put our highest risk tasks first and do those, the ones that are most likely to have hidden unknowns. First, go through that exploratory phase, that exploration plan of where we need to identify and try to, even if we don't finish those tasks, explore them enough to uncover as many hidden unknowns as we can. So that way we're doing the high risk stuff first. And then that also then changes the expectation. If I say, hey, it's going to take me 2 months, 3 months before I can show you an interface, then when I get my deadline like a month later, 2 months later, the person's going to be so excited. Wow, you were able to finish that up really quickly. It took you a long time to get started, And if I'm not experienced at working with this type of person, I might be like disappointed, like, well, this other guy here could easily get it done much faster. No, that's not true. What they could do is they could show you a rough draft much faster, but they can't finish it much faster. It's that classic the 90-90 problem. Like the 90% of the task takes the first 90% of the time. The remainder 10% of the task takes the other 90% of the time. And so often, and that's because what we do is we front load all the easy tasks, all the tasks that we're really certain about, that we're comfortable about, that help show progress to our boss, to our client about in the front. And all the tasks that have like huge unknowns that are behind the scenes or under the water, use whatever metaphor you want, all those tasks we push toward the back of the project. And those are the ones that then take the other 90% of the time. So what I would say is one strategy there is to like pull all those tasks, go through the process of trying to identify, categorize. This is a type of task, like it's an invention task, an architecture task. It's, something that is going to have a bunch of hidden unknowns, push that to the front of the project. And all the easy things like deciding what color to use or whatever you're going to do. Like, if you're putting a report of like, okay, formatting the report at the end, put all those toward the end when you know that all that is predictable.
Oh wow, that's actually that's a two insights in one. So the first one, I didn't ring one for complexity, the idea of complexity versus hidden. So complexity meaning interdependence, and then the other is the tendency, the psychological tendency for us to do the non-complex, less interdependent, more understood and more known activities upfront, because you go for the low-hanging fruit, supposedly. Low-hanging fruit is a nice idea when you don't have a lot of interdependency, but I guess what you're saying is low-hanging fruit is a problem when what you're really doing is delaying the hidden interdependencies until you have 10% of the time left, and that's where you're basically shifting the risk to the wrong place, and you're creating problems for yourself.
Let's use the low-hanging fruit metaphor, right? That it comes from picking food off a tree. So if I go and say like, I need to pick all the food off this tree, and I start with picking all the low-hanging fruit and spend like 5 hours picking the low-hanging fruit, and then like, okay, well, the tree's half done, so it's only going to take another 5 hours to do the rest of the tree. No, that's the fruit that's all the way high up in the tree that I need to climb. I need to like go out on that little branch that might break. Maybe it does break, and now like I need to like heal my broken leg while I'm trying to like pick the rest of the fruit, or I need to go get a ladder now, and I didn't think, because the low-hanging fruit I didn't need a ladder, but the other fruit I need a ladder for. All the complexity there. If instead we started with the stuff at the top, and at the end you just pick the low-hanging fruit. The low-hanging fruit is easy. We can predict it. There's so then we are able to meet our deadlines much better.
Also, the low-hanging fruit, because it's so near to you. And so there's some trees that we have here in the Caribbean, for example, that when they're laden with fruit, the fruit hangs lower. And as you pick fruit, all the fruit rise because the tree doesn't have as much weight to carry, right? So you made it even doubly worse by going with that strategy. Psychologically, it feels good to do that. But practically, in terms of getting the entire project done, if it involves all the fruit, then it makes no sense to pick the low-hanging fruit first. You're better off, as you say, going for the complexity, because there actually is an interdependence on some trees between the fruit, and picking the order in which you pick that has a big influence on the total time it takes to pick all the fruit. We might be straining the metaphor here, but
I think that's useful. I think that's useful, because if you think about, a lot of times the other factor that comes into play is if I do like the easy tasks first, and then I just go to the hard tasks that uncover a bunch of unknowns. Sometimes those unknowns change the nature of those early tasks. I have to go back and redo them, or I didn't need to do them at all. So like I'm winding doing like unneeded work in the beginning. Whereas if I did those tasks with the high unknowns, I'd be much more certain that the work I do after that is going to be appropriate to the project, and I'm not going to need to redo it. So again, like that's similar to your metaphor. If I tackle all the low hanging fruit, it changes the nature of
the job,
everything else that comes after it. And in the task world, it means like, I decided to develop the whole interface before I dove deep into the complexity of the problem. And then once I go into the complexity of the problem, I realize, oh, wait a second, this problem has these certain characteristics. We need a completely different interface. So I went and built everything based upon the easy stuff, the low hanging fruit, and then realized I have to go back and redo it. And so that introduces even additional work, additional time and delay in your project, because you're redoing stuff that you wouldn't need to have done had you started with the more difficult tasks first, the higher risk tasks first, and de-risked your project, and then gone forward from there.
So the higher risk, the more hidden, the more complex, the ones you have the least information about or the least knowledge about. Just repeating that for those who are listening, that, for Evelyn, it's go for those that introduce the most risk first, because they'll reduce the risk the most. Yes?
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. So there's this concept, and we talked a little bit in episode 10, the Can You Fix Your Time Optimism podcast, on your risk curve and how do you reduce your risk curve. And the idea is, if I
love that you remember what we talked about 6 months, 9 months ago. Trevor, really? I could, what I did last week. I track all of my hours, let alone what we did. So please break it down for us as if I wasn't there either. Go ahead.
It's having a note system. I don't my memory is shit. The idea there is, if I take all the tasks on a project and I assign them a risk score. So let's say I assign them a risk score 1 to 5. And then I add up all those scores. Then what I have is the total risk for my project. So maybe for one project, I have a risk of 200. And like, say it's a 10-month project, right? So a linear way to reduce your risk score is at 200, I'm going to just chop away at tasks with 220 risk points per month. And then I'm just kind of going down. Well, usually what's going to happen is you're going to have a huge number of tests that are going to have like a risk score of 1 or 10, 2 or something. Let's actually use 1 to 10 as the risk thing. And then I'm going to have other tests.
Or 1 is the highest risk?
1 is the lowest and 10 is the highest. Yeah,
okay.
So
sorry.
and you can use different scales. Like, I mean, you might want to use 1 to 50, 1 to 100 on the risk.
Right. Okay.
And the thing is, so say I've got a task that I tackle that has a risk score of 1. Well, I just reduced it by 1 out of 200. Now I'm to 199. If instead I do my task that has a risk score of 10, well, now I'm at 190. I do another 10 tasks, I'm down to 180, so you can see that I can greatly reduce my risk very early in the project by doing a couple of those key high risk tasks versus doing a whole bunch. I'd have to do, on that sort of scale, 10 low risk tasks just to meet 1 high risk task. But that's what we tend to do because they're easy and because we know what to do and because they show progress to our boss, our client. Again, though, what we want to do is we want to take that risk, and rather than it just being like staying super, super, super high, and at the very end, we're going to try to do all the high risk things and bring us down to 0. So like 10-month project, it's month 8, and we start at 200, and we're now at 150, and we think we're going to try to do 150 points of risk in 2 months. Not going to happen. Or there's the linear. Okay, I'm going to try to just do 20 points a month, and if you can sustain that, great. what is more effective is if I can try to bring all the tasks, all the high risk tasks at the beginning, so it has this kind of reverse S curve look to it. So where I start with 200 in the first month, and I try to go to 150, 100, and now like at the very last couple months, yeah, then I'm like 80, 60, and bringing it down slowly after that. But you try to rapidly reduce your risk up front, and then handle like the lower risk stuff near the end.
So interesting, because now you're painting a picture for me around project management or task management as a risk consuming activity rather than a time consuming activity.
Yes.
Because usually when we think of time blocking, we're thinking of, I'm sure Evelyn thinks of this, that, okay, well, I have all these things to do and they all have an assigned time, and the choice of what I do first and second is probably more about convenience than it is risk. I imagine that most time blocking folks, as you're listening to this podcast, listeners, you may not think in terms of risk. But what Trevor is saying, essentially, I think, is that if you're dealing with complex tasks, you must think in terms of risk. When she was when Evelyn was 5 years ago, when she had simple stuff to do, easier tasks were more regular, they were more predictable, then it wasn't as much of an issue. But now that she's moving into more complex projects and she's time blocking her time, now she needs to bring in risk as a method of prioritizing what goes in her calendar and what and when. What do you think, Trevor? Am I accurately representing kind of where you're heading with this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's accurate. Like, I think to the degree possible, and it's not always possible, doing the higher risk items first are going to help you meet your deadlines more than the typical strategy, like I said, which is to either think of the project as a linear project and I just do step 1, 2, 3, 4, or a lot of times what people will do is they'll just grab the easy tasks to gain momentum, but then they just keep grabbing easy tasks and they don't switch to the hard tasks fast enough, and they defer them to the end because they're uncomfortable because they have a lot of unknowns. And so those are the recipes for disaster.
I've never seen time blocking portrayed as a risk consuming activity. I've never seen that. I've seen, as I said, time consumption or effort consumption or energy consumption. You spend high energy in the morning, and we talk about it in terms of those, our deadlines, which how when will the task be due, and you work on the ones that are the most urgent, but not in terms of risk. And really, risk is the right filter to use if you're going to be talking about hidden and complex tasks, no?
Yes, and let's real quick connect risk to time for people. Mm-hmm. So you can measure risk in different ways. One way to measure risk is to say, what is my time variance in doing the task, right? Mm-hmm. So like a task with a risk level of 1 means if I estimate it's going to take me an hour, pretty much takes me an hour. If we look at best case, worst case, best case is an hour, worst case an hour, expected case it's an hour. Okay, so what we want to do is connect time to risk. And so if you think about a 1 hour task, if it has a risk of 1, then that means that like it's going to take me an hour to do, which basically, like if we say best case, worst case, best case is an hour, worst case is an hour. That's a risk level of 1. If we think a risk level of 10, and we're doing estimation, our best case is going to take an hour. Our worst case is going to take 10 hours, right? And so there is a risk level of 10. It's a 10 times spread in the amount of time. If I think it might take 4 hours, a risk level 10, it could take from 4 to 40 hours. And so one way to kind of like just come up with your risk scores is to think, what's my best case, what's my worst case, and just divide my worst case over my best case. And that gives me a kind of risk multiplier for my task. So I think that can be a useful way to kind of think about risk. The second thing that I add to that often is that people will tend to be optimistic about their risk. So having categories of risk. So editing is, for me, is almost always a risk level of 1 because there's not much involved there. Whereas something like refactoring, rewriting, all that might be a level of 2. It's fairly easy, like might take a little bit longer than I expect, but not dramatically longer. Then we go into things like replicating, doing something someone else has already done, but I've never done it before. Well, maybe that's a risk level of 3. Going up to things like designing whole systems, maybe that's 4. Invention might be 5, might be 10 for invention. But like coming up with like, here's the different categories of tasks I do, and assigning a default risk level to that you just automatically assume it's going to be that risk level. And then you can tweak it from there, but that way you're not going off and going like, oh yeah, this is easily going to be like 2 when it's going to be designing a whole system. You're like, no, that really should be 4 or 5, and then accepting that, yeah, if it means it's a risk level of 5, and I said it was, I'm estimating it 4 hours, I need to accept that it might be 20 hours to do that task. So how do I factor that into my time blocking? And what that means is I need to have a lot less granularity in my time blocking. So my time blocking is more, I'm creating a time block, which is advance project X forward, right? It's not down to the level of, well, it's not a buffer. What it is just saying like, I'm going to allocate a lot more time blocks, but I'm not going to be as specific about what I'm doing in those time blocks. Because I'm not going to say like, I'm not going to say, okay, task 1 is time block, here's a 2-hour time block, and then tomorrow I'm going to do task 2 in this 2-hour time block, and the next day task 3 in 2-hour time block. I'm just going to say I'm working on project A, and I've got my list of tasks, and I'm working down that task list, recognizing that task 1 might actually take up all the time blocks in that week.
Right. So this is a 3-in-1 insight. We deserve 3 medals at this point. and I I'm looking at the clock and I'm thinking, oh, so Trevor drops an insight bomb right at the end. We're crossing the finish line. Like, because we need another hour. Trevor, we need, so the first one I got was that the spread of your task, the distribution, essentially, the earliest and latest times, that we often assume that there's no spread. that if we think it's going to take an hour, it's going to take an hour. Really, what we're saying is going to take anywhere between a half an hour and 5 hours, and we don't account for that in our time blocking. We behave as if we've gotten the estimate is accurate with respect to the spread. And then we're over optimistic, so we think, oh yeah, I know, when the median time is probably more like 3, or the average time is more like 3, and we don't account for that either. And then the third thing you said is that the way we define the activity is we over-define it essentially and say that we're going to do this part in this time block. When the truth is, we don't know that we're going to do that part in that time block. We know that we're going to work on that project in that time block, but if we become too specific, we run the risk of then not accomplishing what we said we were going to, and that causes a problem. Did I catch those 3 accurately?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I would make the one clarification there that you can go more granular in your time blocking for lower risk tasks. So I might be able to say like, hey, I'm going to outline 3 articles in this hour time block because I know how long it takes me to outline an article because I've done that 100 times. So I can go very granular. Whereas once you go into tackling more higher risk tasks, you have to go reduce your granularity. You have to look at and say, I'm not going to schedule this time block for a specific task. I'm going to schedule it for a specific project and be at that higher level. And then the tasks, I'm just going to try to make as much progress as I can in that time block. And you can do things like time block blueprints and things like that to kind of like try to push some of that a little bit forward. But the goal, the key there is that you're not going to be able to say, hey, I'm going to be able to get task one done in a fixed amount of time, because you don't know, because it has a high level of risk, a high level of time variability in how long it needs to get done.
Right. So someone like an Evelyn, then it's Evelyn is all of us at some point. Is that once you get past a certain level of simple time blocking, let's call it that, and you move into more complicated time blocking, the way you think about your schedule needs to change. The way you think about your task allocation to your calendar needs to shift. The way you think about your estimations needs to alter, and you need to have a filter between simple tasks and more complex tasks, and you treat the two very differently. And even the sequencing of them actually now has an impact. If you're working on an overall complex project, it's not as simple as they're not all equal anymore. Some have a greater impact than others, and the actual sequencing now matters. Whereas, when you're just cranking widgets, the sequence is like, I'll do whatever I feel comfortable doing in the moment. So, but this is like, it's like another episode, Trevor. This is like a whole nother conversation for us to have. So you've teed us up for a continuation of this one, I think. Tell me if I'm wrong, but I don't see us closing this out in the next 2 minutes and then saying, "Oh, okay, we've solved world hunger and we've solved the problem of hidden and complex tasks." What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think we've got a whole nother episode in there. So just to summarize in there, I would say that if you're doing simple tasks, managing your time works. If you're doing complex tasks, focus a little bit more on managing your risk, and then managing your time from when you're using that time to move the progress forward, but not trying to do time estimation if you've got high risk projects.
I tell you, I want to talk to you about these things some more right now. But Trevor, how can people hear more of your wisdom and your insights? You're a polyglot of no mean order. Tell me if I'm wrong, but that's how I experience you. You're like brilliant in these different fields, and how can they hear more of your wisdom?
Yeah, so I blog regularly at dayoptimizer.com, which is also the digital day planner app that I run. I also am running the podcast AI Meets Productivity. So if they go to aimeetsproductivity.podbean.com, or if the domain finally gets live, aimeetsproductivity.com. You can also find that on any podcast player. It's in the Apple Podcast Store. And and then I occasionally blog at fastfedora.com, but that's been a little bit wild since then. So.
Well, again, always a pleasure to have you on. Love having you in this format, because I know there's something that's going to happen and that's unprecedented, and I just know I've never heard before, and I'm pretty sure our listeners have. We just don't hear these things in podcasts, these kinds of discussions, or even in books for that matter. It's just, we just haven't gotten there when it comes to time blocking and task management in terms of the kind of the level of, say, analysis, diagnosis that we need in order to be effective as we go forward. So, Trevor, thanks so much for coming on the show. And folks, keep listening. There's more coming. I want to tell you about an episode that we have coming up. So keep listening.
Here's a clip from our next episode with Jennifer Moran.
I myself have a few time hoarders, and I've noticed, I became aware of this thing that happens when I'm leaving clients' houses as I'm helping them organize, especially if they're a hoarder. They follow me out to the car and try to keep me talking to them. And I didn't really notice it as a problem until another organizer on our national chat mentioned that hoarders are also time hoarders, and they'll try to hoard your time.
And if you want to leave a comment about this episode or any aspect of the work that we're doing here at the Task Management and Time Blocking Podcast, you can go over to www.replytofrancis.info and send me either a message by text or send me a voice message, a voice note. And as you probably know, we have a couple of places that you can interact with other people, talk about this episode. One is at the community, mightytaskers.scheduleu.org, and you'll see the link in the show notes. And the other, of course, is our upcoming Task Management and Time Blocking Summit coming up in March. Two outstanding opportunities to interact with other people about the ideas that you've heard on this podcast or any of our episodes that are coming up. And if you'd like to support the work we're doing, I invite you to click on the Patreon link below to make a donation. And please don't forget to like our show and recommend it to others on iTunes, Stitcher, Google, or whatever podcast app or service you're using. This is Francis Wade. I'm signing out. I hope to see you on a future episode. And until then, take care and all the best. See you later.